The grocery store was humming with a kind of quiet, unremarkable energy that comes at the end of a weekday. People filing through the aisles in weary routines, faces slack with fatigue or lost in thought. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, a sound almost drowned out by the rolling wheels of carts and the occasional beep of a scanner from the checkout lanes. Somewhere between the fresh produce section and the refrigerated shelves, Major Lin Gwyn moved with practiced ease, her motions smooth, precise, almost military. She wore civilian clothes, black jeans, a light jacket, her hair tied back in a low bun, but there was a silent discipline in the way she carried herself. Every motion, every turn of her head seemed measured, economical. Lin was not the kind of person most people noticed in a place like this, but anyone paying close enough attention might have sensed something steely behind her quiet demeanor. She had come here after back-to-back meetings on base, a 14-hour day that had tested not just her stamina, but her patience. Leadership wasn't about barking orders. It was about listening, diffusing conflict, making difficult decisions that no one else wanted to own. The kind of strain that didn't show on your face until you caught your own reflection in a passing window and saw the wear settling in beneath your eyes. Lin glanced at her list. A few essentials, nothing more. Soy milk, rice, spinach, a packet of dried faux noodles if she could find them. She wasn't in a rush. There was something almost therapeutic in the monotony of shopping, choosing vegetables, reading labels, comparing prices. The familiarity of it grounded her. As she rounded the corner toward the snack aisle, she passed a young mother coaxing a toddler into staying still long enough to tie a shoe. Lin smiled faintly, not at them, but at the fragile normalcy of it all. It was a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of her daily life. Commanding troops, overseeing operations, training cadets who still saw the world in black and white. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She didn't check it. Whatever it was could wait. In this small window of ordinary, she wanted no reminders of rank, of duty, of responsibility. Just a woman, on her own time, trying to buy groceries. But then, from the next aisle, came a sound sharp, metallic, disruptive. The clatter of something falling to the floor. 2 items, a packet of ramen and a can of soda, rolling to a stop near her feet. Lin looked up, instinctively scanning for context. A man in uniform, Officer Robert Miller, judging by the name on his badge, stood a few feet away. Late 30s, broad-shouldered, radiating a kind of heavy arrogance that had nothing to do with his actual stature. He had knocked the items off the shelf while reaching for something else, and made no move to pick them up. Their eyes met for a second. He looked at her, not with embarrassment or apology, but with a kind of casual dismissal. Like she wasn't there. Like he had the right to leave messes behind and let others clean them up. Lin felt a flicker of irritation, quickly buried under a layer of calm restraint. She bent down, picked up the ramen and soda, and placed them neatly back on the shelf. Then she turned to him, her tone polite but firm. "Excuse me, I think you dropped these." He didn't thank her, didn't even nod. Instead, a smirk curved the corners of his mouth, sharp, disdainful. "Didn't ask for help, sweetheart," he said, voice laced with something oily, condescending. Typical. Always got something to say, huh? In that instant, Lin felt a shift, not in her body, which remained still, but somewhere deeper. It was a feeling she knew well, the moment when tension slides beneath the surface like a riptide, unseen but powerful. Her face revealed nothing, but inside, years of training clicked into place. Assess. De-escalate. Stay in control. She had come here to rest. To be anonymous, invisible. But something told her this moment would not allow it. Something about the way he squared his shoulders, the practiced menace in his posture. He wasn't just a man having a bad day. He was someone who used his badge like a weapon. And Lin, though tired, though off-duty, knew that she would not look away. It might have ended there. A few rude words in a grocery aisle, 2 strangers going their separate ways. Lin had no desire to escalate anything. She had seen far worse than arrogant men in supermarkets. She had mediated shouting matches in briefing rooms, witnessed soldiers crumble under the weight of unspoken grief, and sat across from young cadets whose bravado barely covered their fear. She didn't need this man's approval. She didn't even need his respect. What she needed was to get out of that store and breathe air that wasn't choked with entitlement. But Officer Robert Miller wasn't finished. As she turned to leave the aisle, Lynn heard the low voice behind her. Not loud, but deliberately audible. Figures you'd have an attitude. Bet you pull rank at home, too. Must be real fun at parties. She stopped. Just for a second. It wasn't the words themselves she'd heard worse. It was the tone. The pointed challenge. The certainty that he could push, that there would be no consequences. That she was just another woman in his way. Something in Lynn's chest tightened, slow and silent like a storm forming over still waters. She turned back, calmly. Is there a reason you're speaking to me like this? Miller chuckled. Not a joyful sound, but one meant to provoke. Don't get your boots in a twist. Just saying some people need to learn to mind their business. Then maybe don't drop your mess for someone else to clean, Lynn replied evenly. Her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of command. Not volume, but clarity. She didn't step closer, didn't raise her hand. Her stillness was its own form of presence. But for men like Miller, stillness could feel like defiance, like judgment, like resistance. Something shifted in his stance. His smile flattened, and in its place, a sneer, subtle, but unmistakable. You one of those, huh? He said. Big on respect when it's yours, not when it's someone else's. I give respect when it's earned, she said. And I don't tolerate bullying. Not in uniform. Not anywhere. For a moment, there was only the sound of the refrigerator humming, the distant beep of a register, the tiny, indifferent noises of a store that had no idea it was holding its breath. Miller stepped forward. Not threateningly, not yet, but deliberately testing boundaries. You calling me a bully? Lynn didn't flinch. If the shoe fits. It was like a spark landing in dry grass. His eyes narrowed, and the edges of his voice hardened. You don't talk to me like that. She didn't blink. Then don't give me a reason to. There it was. The crack in his veneer. The brief flash of something darker behind the badge and bravado. Lynn had seen that look before in barracks, in mess halls, in war zones. Men who mistook power for immunity. Who believed that authority was their birthright, not a responsibility. Who thought women in command were threats to be neutralized, not peers to be respected. What happened next was so fast, so quiet, it might have gone unnoticed if not for the tension stretched taut between them. Miller took another step forward. Too close. Lynn's instincts lit up, not fear, but readiness. Her spine straightened. Her eyes locked on his, cool and unflinching. Then a hand brushed her elbow, gentle, unexpected. A store clerk. Young, maybe 19. Wide-eyed. Ma'am, is everything okay here? The question shattered the tension just enough for air to return to the room. Lynn breathed in slowly, exhaled once, and turned to the clerk. I'm fine. Thank you. The kid nodded, uncertain, and retreated. But the spell was broken. Lynn took a step back, not in retreat but in choice. She would not give this man what he wanted, a scene. She would not let him twist her into the angry woman stereotype he was fishing for. Control wasn't just about command. It was about knowing when to step away and when to act. But her hand reached into her jacket and wrapped around her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Have a good evening, officer, she said and walked away. Miller watched her go, his face unreadable, but his silence louder than anything he'd said. What neither of them knew, what would only come to light later, was that another shopper had been recording. Quietly. Discreetly. Just in case. And in that video, now resting in the cloud, the truth was captured. A truth that wouldn't stay buried. Not this time. The confrontation might have ended there. Lynn had walked away, her expression calm, her posture composed, the kind of control that didn't need to be loud to be felt. But control is a fragile thing. It doesn't only live in the moment, it's tested by what follows. By the unseen ripple effects of confrontation. By the stories people choose to tell about it. And Officer Miller had his own version of the story. Within hours, Lynn began to feel the shift. It started as something small, an odd look from a colleague at base, a strangely clipped tone in a routine email. Then came the requests. Requests that weren't direct accusations, but hinted at impropriety. Just touching base. One message read, "Heard there might have been an incident off-duty. Let us know if you need support." Support. The word felt ironic. By the end of the week, it was clear. Miller had filed a report. Informal enough to avoid formal backlash, but pointed enough to damage reputation. He'd framed it as a concern. Unprofessional conduct by a fellow officer, off-duty, bordering on harassment. It was textbook manipulation, vague, emotionally charged, framed just enough to cast doubt without proof. Lynn sat in her office, rereading the forwarded memo. Her jaw clenched, not from surprise, but from exhaustion. This was not the first time a man had tried to rewrite reality to protect his pride. It was the ease with which systems allowed it that weighed on her. It was always subtle, never overt. Not, "You're a problem," but "We're just checking in." Not, "We don't believe you," but "Let's stay professional." She looked up from her desk, her eyes drifting to the framed photograph on the shelf. Her and her late father, both in uniform. He had taught her that the uniform was sacred, that it was worn in service of truth and protection, not ego. She wondered what he would think of this moment. She wondered what he'd say. By the following week, whispers had become a murmur. She heard her name in hallways where it didn't belong. She noticed when conversations shifted as she entered rooms. She saw the way some of the junior officers watched her now, not with admiration, but wariness. As if they weren't sure who to believe. And then the video surfaced. She didn't know who posted it. It showed up on a low-traffic social media page for local law enforcement accountability. No clickbait. No commentary. Just the raw footage. The supermarket aisle. The terse exchange. Miller's increasingly hostile tone. Her calm response. The camera was shaky, but the sound was clear. The comments came slowly at first, people shocked by Miller's behavior, praising Lynn's composure. Then faster, building momentum. "This is why some officers shouldn't be trusted." She stayed calm and respectful. He escalated. "Someone needs to investigate this guy." The video didn't go viral in the traditional sense, but it was shared. And in small networks, especially within institutions where image matters, it was enough. Enough to flip the narrative. Enough to make her accusers retreat into silence. But that didn't bring relief. Only pressure. Now, instead of whispers, there were meetings. Meetings framed as neutral inquiries, but laced with implication. "We're looking into both sides," they said. "We want to be fair." Fair. Another word that twisted in her gut. In one of the closed-door discussions, a senior officer, a man Lynn had worked beside for years, leaned forward and asked, "Why didn't you just let it go, Lynn?" "It was a grocery store. He's not worth the fallout." She stared at him, steady. "I didn't escalate. I stood my ground." He sighed. "Perception matters. You're an officer. People look up to you." "So, what would you have me do?" she asked. "Let a man in uniform intimidate me because I outranked him? Stay silent so he doesn't feel threatened." His eyes flicked away. "It's not about that." But it was. It had always been about that. Later that night, Lynn sat alone in her apartment, the city humming outside her window. Her phone buzzed on the table, messages from colleagues, friends, supporters. Some were encouraging. Some were cautious. A few asked if she regretted anything. She didn't. But she was tired. The weight of truth isn't in the moment of confrontation. It's in the days that follow. In the moments of self-doubt, the fractured alliances, the quiet punishments. In the knowledge that standing firm doesn't always feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like isolation, like exile in plain sight. Still, she did not waver. The video had told the truth. And the truth had teeth now. She just didn't know yet who it would bite next. The hearing wasn't public, but it may as well have been. Everyone at the department knew it was happening, knew who it involved, knew the stakes. Lynn walked into the Internal Affairs conference room not as a suspect, but not entirely as a witness either. That was the quiet cruelty of systems that demand civility in the face of disrespect. They blur lines until standing up looks like stepping out of place. The room was sterile. No courtroom drama, no raised voices. Just a long table, a few carefully chosen representatives and folders, so many folders. Officer Miller was already there, seated across from her. He wore his uniform, clean and crisp, and a practiced expression that hovered somewhere between concern and humility. His posture was relaxed, but Lynn recognized the tension in his hands, in the way he occasionally tapped his thumb against his palm, an unconscious tick. They asked her to speak first. Walk us through the incident from your perspective.
She did.
Calmly,
Clearly.
without embellishment. She detailed the way he had approached her, the tone he'd used, the way his presence had grown more confrontational with each breath. She admitted to the moment she'd raised her voice, but she framed it as a response to escalating behavior, because that's what it was. She ended her statement without apology, only truth. Then it was his turn. Miller leaned forward, hands folded neatly. He spoke with measured cadence, feigning confusion over her aggressive posture that day. He claimed he had felt threatened, said he was trying to de-escalate the situation but had been shocked by her tone. He did not mention the smirk he wore that day. He did not mention how he had tried to provoke her into something regrettable. One of the officers on the panel asked him, "Are you aware the incident was captured on video?" There was a moment, less than a second, where his face betrayed him. A flicker of tightness around the eyes, the briefest inhale. Then he composed himself. "I've heard about it, sir, but I haven't seen it directly." They played it. The room was silent as the footage rolled. There was no dramatic music, no courtroom gasp. Just the tinny audio of a phone microphone, the cold fluorescence of the supermarket, and two voices. His voice, sharp, needling. Her voice, firm, but even.
His threats.
Her restraint. It ended abruptly, but there was no mistaking what had happened. When the video stopped, Miller opened his mouth, but no one asked him to speak. The lead investigator, a woman Lynn didn't know well, turned to him. "Officer Miller, in your report, you stated that Officer Hale approached you with hostility. Can you explain that discrepancy?" He stumbled. Words came, but they didn't land. He tried to cast doubt on the video's context, questioned the camera angle, the editing. But the panel wasn't moved. The video had been vetted. The timestamps were intact. The truth, as captured, spoke louder than his narrative. Lynn watched him flail, not with satisfaction, but with a cold kind of emptiness. She had prepared for this moment, but she hadn't expected it to feel so muted. Vindication, when delayed and dragged through bureaucratic rituals, loses its sharpness. It becomes something quieter, more tired. The panel recessed. Final decisions would take days, maybe weeks. But everyone in the room knew what the outcome would be. Miller would be disciplined, maybe transferred. He wouldn't be fired, not for this. But the power he had used to intimidate her would no longer protect him. As the room emptied, Lynn remained seated for a moment. Her hands rested on the table, calm. Her pulse had steadied long ago. She didn't need to win loudly. She just needed the truth to settle in the space where silence used to protect lies. Outside the room, the hallway was quiet. She walked past colleagues who didn't meet her gaze, and a few who did, some with apology, some with respect, a few with both. The kind of respect that comes not from title or tenure, but from witnessing someone refuse to bend under pressure. Later that night, she stood on her balcony, the city sprawling beneath her. The air was cool, edged with the scent of late rain. She thought of her father again, his quiet advice about endurance. Not every battle ends with applause. Some just end, and that sometimes is enough. But part of her knew this wasn't over. Not really. Systems don't change because one man is humbled. They change slowly when enough people stop allowing silence to stand in for safety. And Lynn Hale had stopped long ago. She wasn't done. But for tonight, she allowed herself a breath of stillness. The storm had passed, and she was still standing. Weeks passed, not with silence, but with the heavy, dragging pace of institutional response, emails, briefings, and carefully worded statements. Lynn had long learned not to equate time with action. Change didn't happen just because enough days went by. It happened because someone refused to let the quiet settle in. The formal decision came via a department memo, cold, clinical, stripped of the emotional weight the situation had carried for her. Officer Miller was placed on administrative leave, pending reassignment to a non-public role. The findings confirmed his misconduct, citing inappropriate behavior, unprofessional conduct unbecoming of an officer, and a failure to de-escalate a non-threatening encounter. It was not the termination some had hoped for, but it was not nothing. It was a crack, small, imperfect, but visible. Lynn read the memo twice, once as the subject of its buried justice, and once as the woman who had stood in that aisle, being humiliated in front of civilians, and chose not to lose herself to rage. Neither reading gave her peace, but both confirmed what she already knew. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't overreacted. And now there was proof. After the news broke internally, her inbox changed. Quiet messages came in. A female officer 2 precincts over, who said she'd seen the same behavior from Miller years ago but had been too new, too unsure, to speak up. A sergeant who admitted, "I should have said something back then. I didn't. I'm sorry." Even a civilian clerk wrote, "I saw the video. Thank you for not staying silent. We need people like you." They were kind. Some were heartfelt. But Lynn didn't read them for comfort. She read them like data points, evidence that her voice had reached further than the conference room, that something had shifted, however slightly. Captain Reyes called her in for a quiet meeting. No press, no formal speech. Just an office, a cup of coffee neither of them touched, and a conversation that mattered more for what it wasn't. He didn't apologize on behalf of the department. He didn't try to reframe what happened. He just said, "You were right to stand your ground." Then, after a long pause, he added, "We're going to be making some changes. Policy, training, oversight." He looked tired, but he looked sincere. For the first time in a while, Lynn believed him. But justice was never about one man, one outcome. Justice, for her, had always been systemic. She began working with internal leadership on a proposal for peer accountability, a confidential reporting system, backed by a third-party review board. It was technical, dry, layered with red tape. But she poured herself into it because this was what real reform looked like. Slow, thankless, necessary. One night, as she was walking to her car after another late meeting, she passed a group of new recruits just coming out of training. One of them, a young woman with a hard set to her jaw but uncertain eyes, looked at her and nodded. A small gesture, but one loaded with recognition. In that moment, Lynn felt something rare. Not pride, not relief, something closer to resolve. Justice hadn't arrived in the thunderclap of courtroom drama. It came like rain, slow, persistent, reshaping the ground only after time. But it had come, and she had helped bring it. At home, she opened her journal, not one she updated regularly, but one she kept for days that marked a shift. She wrote just a few lines. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and that something mattered. She closed the book, exhaled slowly, and let herself feel the weight leave her shoulders, just enough to sleep. Justice had not roared. It had whispered, but it had spoken, and she had answered. It started with a local blog post, just a few paragraphs on a lesser-known watchdog site titled, "Officer Confronts Fellow Cop Over Misconduct and Wins." No names were used, just a blurred screenshot from the surveillance video and a line that read, "For once, the badge stood for accountability." Then came the ripple. Bigger outlets picked it up. Some focused on the confrontation, framing it as an internal stand for justice within a police department. Others criticized the system that allowed someone like Officer Miller to operate unchecked for years. A national journalist embedded the video in a long-form piece about bystander accountability in law enforcement, noting that Lynn's body language in the footage told a story more complex than any press release could. The clenched jaw, the subtle stepping between Miller and the girl, the quiet fury beneath professional restraint. The internet did what it always did, it fractured. Some called Lynn a hero. Others questioned her motives. Why now? Why didn't she arrest him on the spot? Is she just playing the good cop to get promoted? One post even accused her of orchestrating a staged confrontation for clout, citing grainy, out-of-context footage and a thread of wild speculation. She didn't read the comments. At least, she told herself she didn't. But late at night, in those insomniac hours when adrenaline had faded but rest hadn't arrived, she sometimes scrolled. Not for validation. For understanding. For some signal in the noise that what she had done mattered beyond internal memos and policy revisions. Then there were the interviews. Her department, trying to manage the narrative, offered her up as a kind of internal reform mascot. Officer who spoke up. They asked her to attend press briefings, to sit in on televised panels about ethics in policing. She declined most of them. Not out of fear, but out of principle. She didn't want to be the face of a system still failing others.
Not yet.
Not like this. But the letters were different. Handwritten, mailed, often without return addresses. One from a mother whose teenage daughter had been wrongly searched at a traffic stop. Another from a retired officer who said, "We used to call that watching each other's six." Somewhere along the way, we forgot it meant holding each other to the standard, not just covering up mistakes. And then the girl. A short email, simple. No punctuation. No capitalization. "I saw you on the news. Thanks for not letting him yell at me like that. I didn't know adults were allowed to stop other adults. It made me feel like I wasn't invisible." Lynn reread it 5 times. Then she printed it, folded it gently, and tucked it into her notebook, the same one where she had once written. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Now there was proof of that something. Tangible. Living. The public reaction, for all its chaos, had shifted something larger than her personal ARC department heads began quoting her case in training seminars. Civilian review boards used the footage to push for mandatory peer intervention policies. Activist groups reached out, not to spotlight her, but to ask how to use her story to support structural reform. She found herself navigating a strange dual existence. In uniform, she was still Officer Lynn Carter, just another body in blue walking a beat. But in meeting rooms and media discourse, she had become a symbol. And symbols she knew could be twisted, misused, or worse, forgotten. So she didn't campaign for attention. She worked. Quietly.
Consistently.
She met with policymakers. She reviewed drafts of new departmental guidelines. She volunteered to train rookies in de-escalation, teaching them not just the tactics but the ethics, the internal compass it demanded. She told them, "If you're ever in a room where someone more powerful is doing the wrong thing, and you feel that knot in your chest, that's your conscience. Listen to it, even if it costs you." Some nodded with understanding. Some looked away. She knew not all of them would carry the message forward. But if even one did, that would be enough. For now. One afternoon, walking into a corner store for coffee, she noticed a flyer on the window. "Know Your Rights, free youth workshop with local officers." Her name wasn't listed, but she recognized the program. One she'd helped draft in those early, exhausting weeks after the incident. That was how public reaction worked, she realized. Not in headlines. Not in trending hashtags. But in ripples. Quiet changes in unexpected corners. A child who feels less afraid next time. A rookie who speaks up 1 second earlier. A community that watches, questions, expects more. Justice, she had learned, didn't end with the verdict. It breathed.
Moved.
Echoed. And now, it was echoing in ways she could not always see, but could finally believe in. Years passed, not with fanfare, but in quiet accumulation, of moments, of impact, of stories rewritten by time and choice. Officer Lynn Carter never sought a legacy. She wasn't the kind to brand her name on plaques or let the weight of her actions be shaped into medals. But legacies don't always ask permission. Sometimes, they're forged quietly, like pressure shaping stone, or like memory finding its way into the bones of a place. By the time she made detective, many of the officers who had stood silent that night in the alley had retired or transferred. The department was different, not fixed, never perfect, but altered in tone. Conversations that were once whispered in locker rooms now happened openly in squad meetings. There was tension still, but it was the kind that comes from friction against old systems resisting change, not apathy. Lynn had become something of a myth to the new recruits, not just the cop who spoke up, but the one who stayed, who didn't burn out, who didn't run. She never told them how close she'd come to leaving. There had been nights, especially in the months after the internal hearings, when she'd sat in her car after shift, gripping the wheel, asking herself whether the battle had been worth it. Whether losing friends, being passed over for promotion twice, and enduring the quiet hostility of some peers had bought anyone else any real safety. But every time she considered walking away, something, some letter, some moment, some small change, had kept her grounded. One of the most unexpected threads of her legacy began at a community college criminology class where she had been invited to speak. She went reluctantly, thinking it would be an awkward PR stunt, a checkbox for outreach. Instead, she found 30 faces, young, skeptical, hungry for truth. They didn't ask the usual questions about procedure. They asked about fear, about doubt, about guilt. One student asked, "How do you know when it's the right time to act, when your voice might be the only one?" And she'd answered honestly, "You don't. You just act, and then you live with it." That session sparked what would become a recurring lecture series, informal, unpaid, and anonymous. She insisted her name not be printed on the flyers. But students talked. Word spread. The detective who saved the girl became a whispered presence in academic circles studying law enforcement ethics. Her story was dissected in papers, reenacted in training modules, fictionalized in novels where flawed heroes bore her likeness in shadow and silence. Eventually, a scholarship fund was created in her name, not by her, but by a group of local parents, including the mother of the girl she had intervened to protect. The girl, now a teenager, had written the opening essay for the fund's announcement. It began simply, "I want to become someone who knows when to speak up, because someone once showed me how." Lynn read it late one evening in her apartment, sitting alone with the city pressing up against her windows. She hadn't realized she was crying until her vision blurred. It wasn't pride she felt. It was weight. That delicate, impossible weight of being responsible for something good. Her legacy wasn't clean. It wasn't always praised. There were officers who still wouldn't make eye contact in the hallway. There were parts of the city where her name was still linked with anger, where systemic wounds ran too deep for any one intervention to matter. But she had never set out to fix the whole world. Just one moment, one decision, and then another, and another. In time, a quiet mural appeared near the alley where the confrontation had happened. It wasn't of her face. It was of a badge, not polished or pristine, but cracked slightly in the center. Out of the crack grew a small sapling. Below it, in plain black letters, "Integrity is what grows after the break." Lynn saw it once, on her way home from work, and stood for a long while beneath it. No one recognized her. She didn't take a photo. She just looked, and then she walked away. She never called herself brave, never claimed justice. But in the stories others told, of training shifts where recruits quoted her words, of civilian workshops where children practiced saying no to authority when they needed to, of policy documents drafted with her testimony quietly embedded between lines of legalese, her presence lingered. Lynn Carter became a story passed down, not for her heroism, but for her humanity, for choosing decency when silence was easier, for proving that justice isn't an event, it's a series of choices, made in shadows, upheld in daylight. And in that, she left behind more than change. She left behind belief.